Hello and welcome. You're watching Gravitas with me, Molly Gambhir. Here's a look at what's lined up for you on the show tonight. Tonight, our cover story is about how the US and India are coming together to counter China. It is a grand plan to share tech at the highest level. I am talking about multiple fronts: defense, space, chips. Tonight, we decode for you what this plan is all about, what it means for America and India, and how Beijing is viewing this new strategic cooperation. Also on the show for you tonight, is China beating the drums of war? We piece together the developments over the last 2 weeks and tell you what's brewing. What exactly is China up to? Why does Xi Jinping want his forces to gear up for war? Is the US upset with Volodymyr Zelensky? We tell you what's happening in the US and Ukraine and how things have reached this point. Will hard drugs be legalized in Vancouver? It is an experiment that the world is talking about. We tell you more. And we could soon see the return of the Dodo, a bird that was last seen in the 17th century. We tell you more. They say your enemy's enemy is your friend. Is that the foundation of the new defense bridge between India and America? Or are we seeing the emergence of a new strategic cooperation with wider implications? As I speak, India and America are coming closer to counter a military challenge from China with shared defense technology. And some very interesting meetings are underway in Washington. India's National Security Advisor Ajit Doval is there. So are the other senior officials. They are fleshing out ways in which the two countries can share technology at the highest levels, share expertise on jets, work closely on semiconductors, even space and lunar exploration. If you are thinking this is huge, you are absolutely right. These are major developments in geopolitics and security cooperation. And I can tell you, no one understands their implications better than China. Because Beijing is the principal reason for this cooperation, also the target. You will agree with me when I say that in the last few years, under the aggressive leadership of Xi Jinping, China has become a threat to those it considers its opponents. It has raised the specter of war over and over again, explicitly and implicitly. It has repeatedly provoked India in Ladakh and Arunachal. It has set a virtual target for the military takeover of Taiwan. China has sent warplanes and the Navy to repeatedly threaten Taiwan, raising the stakes in the skies and the seas. China has threatened America in the Pacific and positioned its nuclear missiles towards the American mainland. Beijing is bullying small countries in the South China Sea, sinking Vietnamese vessels, trying to construct research and military facilities on disputed waters. Chinese policies have become a sheer nuisance as it exploits its manufacturing and commercial muscle to control supply chains. Countries like India, America, Japan, Australia are not sitting by idly. How? Let's take a look at the latest developments in the US-India strategic cooperation. It is called the US-India Initiative on Critical and Emerging Technologies. These technologies will shape the course of the 21st century. Defense, for example, it is a sector that India and America already cooperate in. The plan is to take it a step forward. Ajit Doval and his counterpart Jake Sullivan have already met the corporate leaders from the defense industry, the likes of Lockheed Martin, Applied Materials Inc. From the Indian side, there are Adani Enterprises. India and the US are working on the critical area of making jet engines together. American firm General Electric has already applied for an export license for jet engine production. It wants to produce jet engines with India. The US has promised to process this application expeditiously. And then there are microchips, semiconductors. These coin-sized chips are at the core of most modern-day machines. I'm talking about cell phones, laptops, even cars. This is a technology that China wants to dominate. Taiwan is the current global leader. But in 2022, one of the Chinese chip makers developed a chip that was very similar to the Taiwanese version. You see where the story is going? China is catching up. And here's the good news. The Chinese chip makers, SMIC or Semiconductor Manufacturing International Corp, relies heavily on foreign equipment. The plan is to close the tap on the Chinese chip maker and the others. US is reportedly working on a deal to restrict the export of semiconductor-related technology to China. Japan and the Netherlands are likely to follow suit. You see, China's loss is India's gain. And through this partnership, the US will be opening its doors for Indian computer chip specialists in the US. Semiconductors is a sector that India is serious about investing in. The budget announcement being proof. More on this in just a bit. And then there is cooperation in space. The US-India Initiative on Critical and Emerging Technologies. This includes provision for cooperation between NASA and India's space program to send joint human flights. And this, by the way, is just one of the many fronts on which the two countries plan to work together when it comes to space. So how do you think China is looking at all of this? It is planning to launch 60 space missions this year. It is hoping to dominate the space race. But now it hears about India and America's joint effort in space, in planetary defense. You see, China was hoping to flex its muscles in the South China Sea, and now it reads about the Indian and the American military looking to build up maritime security, surveillance capabilities. China was hoping to use technology to dominate the world. And now it learns about India and the US cooperating on emerging technologies. Developing next-generation telecommunication in India, 5G, 6G. And you know what? India-US cooperation has been in the making for a while now. The idea was reportedly tabled during the last Quad meeting in Japan in the month of May. And what's happening now? All the meetings, they are just the first of the many under this scheme. The CEOs of Indian and American defense companies, including from the Indian private sector, will be meeting more frequently now. And government officials will be working more closely. Indian and American academics will be involved in high-grade research. And while the dragon will be breathing hot and cold from the other side of the Himalayas, this is the new roadmap in the strategic map of the world, the route map for the future. And let me tell you that this bodes ill for China. And as India and America strengthen their partnership, the one country that seems to be watching closely, no prizes for guessing which one. I am, of course, talking about China here. Also, no prizes for guessing why. China considers both India and America as its rivals. It looks at them as hurdles in its ambition for global domination. So when India and America sit down to talk, Beijing is bound to be unnerved. It is bound to flex its muscles. Just have a look at the developments over the last 2 weeks. And for the last 2 weeks, Chinese state media has been indulging in constant war rhetoric. One report is on your screen. The Global Times carried this recently. It said that America is pushing India into a proxy war. But is it really? Because last we checked, it was the Chinese president who desperately wants to wage a war. He even said as much during a recent address, by the way, to the PLA troops stationed along the India-China border. Let me give you some context here. Around 10 days ago, Xi Jinping went to the PLA headquarters in Beijing and addressed the troops at a border defense station. And guess what he told them? To remain alert and be ready for combat. And that's not even all. Xi Jinping spoke to members of the Liying, or the Falcon Squad. What is that? It is an elite commando force under the PLA that looks after counter-terrorism operations. And reports say Xi asked them to improve their skills and vigorously perform their duties. Now, we know that most world leaders regularly interact with military branches. They regularly conduct such sessions. So why does this interaction stand out? Because of the timing. It comes just a month after the clash in Arunachal Pradesh. This is when the PLA tried intruding into Indian territory. It violated the line of actual control in Tawang sector, but was pushed back by the Indian troops. And immediately after this, a report emerged, this one. It said that China was trying to weaponize water by building a dam along the Arunachal border. And this apparently will be a 60,000 megawatt dam, which, if we go by China's track record, can by all means be used to trigger floods in the area. And now we have the Chinese president himself taking his war rhetoric a step further, telling his troops to be combat ready. The question is, who does he want them to fight? Who does he want them to engage in combat with? Well, we know the answer, but why state the obvious? And by the way, it's not just India that China is trying to threaten. The United States also is dealing with similar threats, courtesy Taiwan. America's military presence in the Taiwan Strait and its diplomatic support to the island state have heavily upset the Chinese Communist Party. So much so that some in America say war now looks imminent. Look at this headline. Military generals in America say that predictions of a war in 2025 could very well turn into a reality. And one of them is Mike Minihan, a four-star general in the U.S. Army, the head of the U.S. Air Mobility Command. He recently stated in a memo to his troops that China and America will fight a war in the next 2 years. Let me quote from what he said. Xi's team, reason and opportunity are all aligned for 2025. I hope I am wrong. My gut tells me we'll fight in 2025. Now, the general's views do not represent the Pentagon, but they do show how concern about the situation is slowly setting in at the highest levels of the American military. And why just the military? Even the corridors of power are whispering about the prospects of war. Take this report, for instance. A top Republican in the House of Representatives agrees with the possibility of war with China. His name is Michael McCall. He is the chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. He says the American Air Force general's warning could be wrong, but he thinks that he is unfortunately right. And what does that tell you? That it's not just India, but also America that is wary about China's intentions. Are there more? Are there other countries or organizations that think China's warnings are alarming? Yes, there are. Like the Secretary General of the NATO, on Wednesday morning, he traveled to Tokyo and warned that China was substantially building up its military and trying to assert its power in the South China Sea. He, in fact, said China is not an adversary, but one must be careful about the threat that China poses to global security. You have to listen to this.
Beijing is substantially building up its military forces including nuclear weapons, without any transparency. It is attempting to assert control over the South China Sea and threatening Taiwan, trying to take control of critical infrastructure, including in NATO countries. We don't regard China as an adversary, and we don't seek confrontation with China, or actually we don't seek confrontation with anyone. At the same time, we will be remiss if we did not expose the challenges that China poses to our security, to our values, and to our interests.
So this is what we have. Xi Jinping telling his troops to be combat ready, American generals warning of a war in 2025, and the NATO chief telling the world to be wary about China's intentions. Where are things headed? I am afraid there is no easy answer to this question. And despite the growing India-US bonhomie, India is likely to continue with its strong ties with Russia. India has not taken any sides in the Russia-Ukraine war. At the same time, India has called for an end to the fighting. So India is definitely charting a path of its own. That has become more than evident in the budget that was presented this morning as well. It was presented by the Finance Minister, Nirmala Sitharaman. Her budget speech lasted 1 hour, 25 minutes. The main focus of the budget is to help create a prosperous and inclusive society by 2047. That is when India would be completing 100 years of independence. India aspires to be a superpower by then, and India has a blueprint ready for the next 25 years leading to 2047. The coming 25 years have been aptly branded by the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi as Amrit Kal in Hindu religious scriptures. Amrit Kal is regarded as an auspicious period, the period with plethora of opportunities. Sitharaman called today's budget as the first in Amrit Kal. Sitharaman said India would be spending $550.7 billion in the upcoming fiscal. That is an increase of over 7% from the last budget. India's focus is on ramping government spending to boost economic growth and create jobs. After all, there is a general election in 2024. The BJP-led NDA is seeking a third consecutive term. And then there are a slew of state elections scheduled this year as well. Let's just analyze the budget in some detail first. Let's start with the 7 priority areas of the government in the budget. They were spelled out by the minister in her budget address. The 7 priorities have been called as Saptarishi, which would guide India in the Amrit Kal. The 7 areas of focus being inclusive development, reaching the last mile, infrastructure and investment, unleashing the potential, green growth, youth power, financial sector. And a big takeaway is increased spending on capital expenditure. It entails spending on infrastructure and connectivity. It includes expenses on railway and aviation sectors, and these sectors generate massive employment. India's capex is slated to be over $122 billion in 2023 to 24, and that would be 3.3% of the GDP. That is an increase of 33% from last year. Similarly, India will also ramp up its defense, education, and health spending. Let's now talk about the focus on green energy transition. India will be introducing these initiatives to achieve transition towards a green economy as the country eyes achieving net zero emissions by 2070. Enhanced funding for energy storage projects, renewable energy evacuation, a green credit program, the PM Pranam scheme or the PM program for restoration, awareness, nourishment and amelioration of Mother Earth, promoting the use of biogas, afforestation of mangroves. The Finance Minister also announced the creation of 3 centers of excellence. She said these centers would boost India's artificial intelligence or AI capabilities. She said the focus is on Make AI in India and making AI work for India. Further, India would be investing $367 million in its semiconductor mission. The investment expediting development of semiconductor ecosystems in India. At present, India relies entirely on imports to meet its semiconductor requirements. Leading industry players will partner in conducting interdisciplinary research and develop cutting-edge applications and scalable problem solutions in the areas of agriculture, health, and sustainable cities. And this will galvanize an effective AI ecosystem and nurture quality human resources in the field. And finally, let's look at how the budget would impact the common man. For starters, the income tax rebate limit has been increased to 7 lakh rupees. The limit was previously 5 lakh rupees. The tax slabs have been reduced to 5 from 7. And the news is expected to bring a lot of cheer in the large sections of the Indian middle class. We also get you a list of the items that have got expensive and what all has become cheaper, what gets costlier: vehicles, cigarettes, precious metals, bicycles, toys. What's gotten cheaper: inputs for mobile phone manufacturing, lithium iron cells, aeroplanes, other aircraft, specific inputs for electric vehicles. And I would like to end the story on a lighter note. The parliament burst into laughter after the minister's slip of tongue. She mistakenly called for replacing the old political class while speaking about the old vehicle replacement policy. We hope the budget outcomes evoke similar sentiment among all the Indians.
Vehicle replacement is an important continuing policy, replacing the old political, replacing. Absolutely. Thank you. Replacing old polluting vehicles. May be applicable, right? Replacing old polluting vehicles is an important part of greening our economy.
And let's now shift our attention to Pakistan. It is fighting a battle of its own, a battle against its homegrown terror outfits. Outfits that Islamabad bred and nurtured only to find itself at the receiving end of their actions. The blast in Peshawar on the 30th of January came as a telling reminder about this very fact. A powerful explosion ripped through a mosque, reducing parts of it into rubble and killing over 101 people. This was by far the deadliest attack in Pakistan since the Army Public School massacre. The question is, who was behind it? Initially, the Tehreek-e-Taliban had claimed responsibility for the attack, only to distance itself from it later. So the authorities are back to square one. They have been left collecting clues and detaining possible suspects. Some of the suspects were detained earlier today. The police has not revealed their names, nor the details about their role, but it did say that the bomber who conducted the attack may have had internal assistance from the officials, assistance that helped him evade security checks. And this leaves one wondering about the state that Pakistan has gotten itself to, where Pakistan's own officials are allegedly helping terrorists kill their own people. There is unfortunately no other way of putting this. For decades, Pakistan funded terror groups to gain an upper hand over India. It trained them, armed them, and gave them shelter, only to have its own hand bitten. And I am saying all of this because this attack is not an isolated incident. In the last 18 months, Pakistan has seen many similar attacks. In fact, the month of December last year was the most violent one on record. There were at least 24 terror attacks, 24 attacks. And just a month into 2023, Pakistan witnesses its most violent attack in almost a decade. This only shows how the clouds of terror have completely engulfed the country. Be it the TTP, the Tehreek-e-Taliban, or the Afghan Taliban, they all seem to be waging a silent war against the Pakistani state. And if I speak of the TTP specifically, last year it mounted over 367 attacks, 367, killing over 1,015 security officials. And these attacks were not just restricted to the tribal areas. Some of them also unfolded in major cities like Islamabad. And then we have the Baloch insurgents. Reports say they conducted over 500 attacks in Pakistan last year, killing a total of 800 people. Most of these attacks unfolded in Balochistan and targeted some big projects launched by Islamabad. And then we have the Afghan Taliban. Throughout the last 6 months, it has been fighting with Pakistan over the Durand Line, the line that forms the border between the two sides. There has been cross-border firing, attacks on Pakistan security officials, and warnings telling Islamabad that times have changed, that the era of a Taliban silently following Pakistan's orders is long gone. And what does that tell you? That Pakistan is facing challenges on 3 fronts, from the insurgency in Balochistan to the TTP's terror in the country's north, to an increasingly assertive Taliban in Kabul. It is triple trouble for Islamabad. And what this also highlights is how the myth of Pakistan's policy of strategic depth has been busted. The myth of Pakistan using Afghanistan as a 6th province against India, that has completely collapsed. And this is embarrassing to say the least. The question here is, inflation in Pakistan has hit a 48-year high, a 48-year high. I am not the one saying this. Pakistan's own central bank is saying this. It says at 27.55%, Pakistan is seeing the highest inflation rate since May 1975. And what's worse, economists say this figure could increase in the days ahead. The implications are already clear. For the last 1 week, containers of goods items, raw material, equipment have been stuck at ports because Pakistan does not have money to buy them. It has curtailed all imports. And let's not even talk about the Pakistani rupee. The country's own media says that it has become the worst performing currency in the world. This was after the rupee hit an all-time low of 270 against the dollar. Today, it picked up to 268 against the dollar, but analysts are saying this is just a minor improvement and the worst is yet to come. What does that tell you? That Pakistan is stuck between a rock and a hard place, just to put it mildly. On one hand, it is dealing with the resurgence of terror, and on the other, it is dealing with an economy on a deathbed. And from where I see it, there is no way Pakistan will be able to come out of these two situations anytime soon. Let's now talk about what's happening in Ukraine. A few days back, it finally managed to secure the delivery of Western tanks. But as it turns out, its weapons wish list does not end at tanks. Kiev is now asking its Western allies for warplanes, a demand that has made the Western leaders concerned. Why is that? 2 reasons here. One, because they think that giving fighter jets to Ukraine could escalate this conflict further and draw them closer into the war. And 2, because they are already quite stretched. They say that they have already given Ukraine too much, be it financial aid, diplomatic support, or the delivery of weapons. And some in the West are saying they have already done plenty to support Ukraine in this war. So this demand hangs in balance. America, for one, has made its stance clear. It says that it will not be sending F-16 jets to Ukraine. President Joe Biden said as much when a reporter posed this question to him. Listen to this.
Decided on the Mr. President.
Will the United States provide F-16s to Ukraine?
No. Decided on the Mr. President.
Will the United States provide F-16s to Ukraine?
No.
Just no, that is all that the president said. But why? That he did not say. But some American media reports have. They say that Ukraine's demand for the F-16 fighter jets is being met with skepticism by the White House. They are apparently puzzled over why Ukraine is making such a public show of asking for these jets, when in private the jets were not even mentioned on top of Ukraine's wish list of weapons. According to one such report, in recent months, American officials held various private talks with their Ukrainian counterparts. But the fighter jets did not figure high on the country's priority list. Instead, these officials were more focused on long-range missiles. America's allies in the West have come out to back these claims. Take the French president, for example, Emmanuel Macron. He recently said that he would not rule out the delivery of the warplanes to Ukraine, but he was yet to receive an official request from Ukraine to do so. And the same story with the Netherlands. The country's leader recently said that he is ready to consider Ukraine's request, but he has not received one yet. That Ukraine may be talking about this in public, but has not mentioned it in the official interactions. So how should we perceive this? Are these signs that Western support to Ukraine is waning, that Western leaders are growing tired of Ukraine's demands, its ever-growing wish list, and above everything else, are they accusing Ukraine of making a public show of such demands to gain sympathy? These are some obvious questions that come to mind. A statement by the German Chancellor answers these queries quite well. A few days ago, remember, he said the West needs to hold a serious debate on supplying weapons to Ukraine, a debate that should be based on factual issues like domestic politics. What he meant, essentially, was that Western countries should start prioritizing their people first, not the aspirations of Ukraine. Have a look at this.
What we need now is a serious debate to decide what has to be decided without creating a bidding war, in which perhaps domestic political motives are in the foreground instead of support for Ukraine. When it comes to such important things as weapons, it has to be about factual issues, about rational weighing, and that is why everything has been said about this. Let me remind you once again that right at the beginning of the war, the American president and I ruled out no-fly zones, for example, because that would have led to a direct escalation of the war between Russia and NATO. And we also rejected, for example, such nonsensical requests as ground troops. And therefore, once again, everything has been said, including by me.
This statement was made last week, and this week, the former French President François Hollande made some very interesting remarks. He said that Vladimir Putin is not mad, but just radically rational. That he's got his own reasoning and wants to function within the framework of that reasoning. How does one perceive this statement? Is the former French president trying to justify the Russian leader's actions? Is he trying to convince the West that he is not really the villain that they have declared him to be? These are questions officials in France must ask themselves. Meanwhile, the officials in Britain also have some questioning to do. Have a look at this report. It talks about how support for Ukraine is faltering in the United Kingdom, how the discourse there and the attitude towards the war has drastically changed. This report is based on a poll by YouGov. It recently asked the Britons whether the UK should increase support to Ukraine. And guess what? Only a quarter of Britons were in favor of increasing support to Kiev. A quarter. My point is quite simple. From Biden saying no to Ukraine's request for fighter jets, to European leaders asking Ukraine to file an official request, to the German Chancellor asking the West to prioritize domestic issues, to the former French president calling Vladimir Putin rational, and now British citizens voting against increasing funds to Ukraine. There seems to be a recalibration of sorts going on in the West. A recalibration which revolves around one question: how long can the West sustain its support to Volodymyr Zelensky? And from that war, let's talk about another one. This one is being fought by Australia. It was fighting a war against time. A war against time, which it now has won. A tiny radioactive capsule went missing 2 weeks ago, and even though it was minute in size, the capsule posed significant health risks to those who would be exposed to it. It was an uphill battle for the Australian authorities, like searching for a needle in the haystack. But the Australian emergency services did it. They accomplished the task. They tracked down this capsule. What is the fuss all about? Why did a coin-sized capsule trigger so much stress, so much fear? It was 8 millimeters long, 6 millimeters wide. But do not be fooled by its size. The capsule contained a small quantity of cesium-137, which is a radioactive material, the same one released in nuclear reactors. And who doesn't know about the horrors of such radioactive elements? Fukushima, unforgettable example. The lost capsule posed considerable health threats. It could cause skin damage, burns, radiation sickness. Just to put this in simpler terms, the slightest exposure to the metal would be like receiving 10 X-rays in an hour. So how did such a hazardous capsule get lost? Why were the authorities so negligent? The gauge containing the capsule was being transported by a subcontracted company. On the 12th of January, it was picked up from Rio Tinto's mine site in the Pilbara region and was being moved to a storage facility in the suburbs of Perth. The movers were unsuspecting when they unpacked the gauge on the 25th of January. It was found to be broken. And much to everybody's fear, the capsule was missing. The transporters realized they had made a grave mistake. And the mining company, Rio Tinto's chief, apologized for this.
Of course, the simple fact is this device should never have been lost. We're sorry that that has occurred. And we're sorry for the concern that that has caused within the Western Australian community.
And soon a huge search operation was launched. There was a lot of ground to cover. The capsule was being transported along the route across the state, so the search area was quite huge. I'm talking about 1,400 kilometers here. The hunt involved a slew of government agencies. The Police Department of Defence, the Australian Radiation Protection and the Nuclear Safety Agency, and the Australian Nuclear and Science Technology Organisation, all of them searching frantically for this capsule. And it was finally tracked down after that week-long operation. They used specialized radiation detectors during that hunt. The capsule was found just a short distance away from the mine. A 20-meter exclusion zone has been established at that site. But the question still remains. Who is responsible for this entire fiasco? How did the capsule go missing? The authorities have launched an investigation to get to the bottom of the situation. The transporters could be in legal trouble if negligence is proved. Rio Tinto is already struggling to repair its reputation in Australia, by the way. In 2020, it blasted a 46,000-year-old site while expanding an iron ore mine. It was of sacred importance for the indigenous Australians. Many of its top bosses had to stand down after the incident. And before the mining giant could recover, it has been involved in yet another blunder. And it's not just Rio Tinto. The truth is, such radioactive blunders are not new. Sensitive and hazardous nuclear materials have time and again gone missing. Since 1950, there have been 32 nuclear weapon accidents that resulted in accidental launching, firing, detonating, theft or loss of the weapon. And these mishaps are known as broken arrows. To date, 6 nuclear weapons have been lost and never recovered. One striking example here is the disappearance of Boeing B-47 Stratojet. This was in the year 1956. The aircraft took off from MacDill Air Force Base in Florida. It was supposed to land in Morocco after a non-stop flight. The flight was carrying 2 capsules of nuclear weapons material. It completed the first aerial refueling without incident, but it never made contact with its tanker for the second one. The base of the clouds was over 14,000 feet high. The visibility was poor. The aircraft went missing over the Mediterranean Sea without a trace. Extensive search failed to locate the missing flight or the crew. The nuclear capsules also disappeared. Sounds surreal, does it not? Where did the flight go? What about the nuclear capsules? Did they land in the sea? Just think of the radiation that must have produced. The health hazard that it could have posed. Speaking of which, it is a relief that the one that went missing in Australia now has been found. And thankfully, no casualties were reported along the way. And we now move on to the fallout of the Hindenburg researchers' claims against Gautam Adani. There's a huge development here. Just a few moments ago, India's financial market regulator, SEBI, said it is undertaking a full-scale examination into the falling value of Adani shares. As per Reuters in the morning, it seemed that Adani had recovered some investor confidence after his flagship firm's share sale weathered the Hindenburg allegation storm. The Adani Group firm stock was recouping losses on bourses until yesterday. Adani firm's shares had lost $65 billion in market value. Adani's personal wealth had dropped by at least $34 billion. But the Adani Group's shares were recovering today. They had an upward run for 2 successive sessions. But that was until Credit Suisse, an influential global brokerage firm, had dropped a bombshell. Credit Suisse would no longer accept Adani bonds as collateral for marginal loans. The Swiss banker has assigned a zero lending value for the notes issued by the Adani firms. Adani's dollar bonds have reversed their earlier gains. Bloomberg estimated that Adani Group's losses have now swelled to a whopping $92 billion.
Adani's empire is in the middle of an ominous storm. The rout started last week after Hindenburg's report. It accused Adani companies of brazen stock manipulation. It said Adani did so by creating a network of shell companies in tax havens. Adani has called those charges baseless. But not everyone thinks that way. Not Credit Suisse, for sure. It is an influential name in the global financial world. Credit Suisse has now stopped accepting Adani bonds as collateral. What does this mean? For starters, Credit Suisse has taken Hindenburg's charges against Adani seriously. Clients looking to borrow from Credit Suisse will have to provide other collateral. Otherwise, the clients would risk liquidating their securities. Adani firms have been hit hard by the Swiss lender's decision. All the 10 listed companies backed by Adani Group closed near their lower market limits. And by how much did the Adani Group shares crash today? Adani Enterprises dropped by 30%, Adani Ports and ZIS by 25%, ACC Limited by 9%, Adani Green Energy by almost 8%, Adani Power by 5%, Adani Total Gas by 20%, Ambuja Cement by 19%, Adani Transmission by 9%, Adani Wilmar by 5%. The crash in Adani Scripps comes a day after its $2.5 billion FPO was fully subscribed. However, there is a catch there. The FPO managed to sail through because of support from high net worth individuals. The institutional investors also salvaged the FPO. Most of the retail investors stayed away from it. Who would have thought that Adani, who was once Asia's richest man, would face a fate that befell upon him? Another fallout of Credit Suisse's decision, Adani is no longer India's richest man, and he is not in the top 10 list of the world's wealthiest billionaires list either. Mukesh Ambani is now richer than Adani.
Moving on for now, what happens when something is forbidden, proclaimed illegal or prohibited? It attracts more interest, perhaps even stigma. So what do you do to destigmatize it? You loosen up the reins. At least that is what Canada seems to be doing. The country has been grappling with drug overdoses. Trafficking has become increasingly common. According to the official data, in fact, 32,000 Canadians have died due to drug-related reasons since 2016. The province of British Columbia accounted for about a third of them. And then came the COVID-19 pandemic. It disrupted illicit drug supply chains and support services, leaving people with more toxic drugs than they used alone. In 2021, there were 2,306 deaths due to illicit drug toxicity in British Columbia. This was the highest annual number to be recorded. The figure slightly decreased to 2,272 in 2022. And as you can see, the picture remains grim. But the government has come up with a peculiar solution. British Columbia has become the first Canadian province to decriminalize several hard drugs. And now, as bizarre as it may sound, but it's true, residents older than 18 years old will be allowed to carry up to 2.5 grams of drugs. This includes cocaine, heroin, fentanyl, morphine, MDMA, which is also known as ecstasy. And this is the beginning of a 3-year trial. It hopes to deal with the increasing drug abuse in the province. Now pay attention. Drug use is still illegal. It has simply been decriminalized under certain situations. Any amount of other hard drugs not mentioned in the exemption would still be illegal. They will not be sold in stores. They are also not allowed in elementary and secondary schools, licensed childcare facilities, at airports and on Canadian Coast Guard vessels and helicopters. The police will also have legal authority to remove the people from the private premises, such as shopping malls, bars, cafes, if drugs are used openly against the wishes of the owner. Now the question is, why is the Canadian government doing this? I already told you, to remove the stigma around drug abuse, so that people feel safe enough to admit that they are addicted, so that they can come forward and ask for the help that they need and deserve. The exemptions can help reduce the barriers and the stigma that prevent the people from accessing the life-saving supports and services. Let's listen in to what the residents had to say.
Yeah, I think that's a step in the right direction. Obviously, I believe full legalization would be better. Legalization means you can write you can write laws, you can control it. But yeah, I think a lot less people are going to be suffering from overdose. People will be able to get help. People are more willing to go get help. People aren't going to have as much stigma, hopefully. Hopefully, that's only time will tell. But yeah, I think overall this is a good thing for the city.
I feel like it's very difficult to form an opinion at this point. I feel like there's probably a reason why they decided to do it. And I think like any subject, there is pros and cons, right? So I feel like if we can try for 3 years and see the results, I think only the results can really tell us if it's going to create a positive effect.
Meanwhile, the British Columbian Minister for Mental Health and Addictions has said, and I'm quoting, decriminalizing people who use drugs breaks down the fear and shame associated with substance use and ensures they feel safer reaching out for life-saving support. The move seems well-intended and rather ambitious. But what if it backfires? What if, instead of making things more transparent, it further increases the complications? You see, the exemptions can inspire more people to possess and consume drugs without the fear of any repercussions. The administration of British Columbia says that substance use is a public health matter and not a criminal justice issue, which is true to a large extent. But it is also giving a free pass to people with an addiction. What if it doesn't turn out in their favor? That is why the exemptions have been put in place on a temporary basis. The trial will be ending on the 31st of January in 2026, and this period will help determine if the change was for better or for the worse. Canada's approach towards the problem is rather refreshing. It is radically different from the harsh crackdown which is commonly adopted by countries across the world. Take the Philippines, for example. President Rodrigo Duterte publicly ordered the country's top customs official, remember, to shoot and kill drug smugglers on sight. He has repeatedly and openly threatened drug dealers with death. And in Malaysia, those who sell drugs can be punished with death. China also hands out executions for certain drug crimes. Amid such a global environment and harsh practices, British Columbia's move is not only ahead of its time, but it also leaves a lot of room for understanding and empathy. However, I have to say it comes with its own risks and drawbacks. Perhaps the picture would be clearer after some time. Have you heard of the Dodo? Quite possible that you have not, and for sure none of you have seen it around. In fact, it was last seen in the 17th century. But it could be making a comeback. How exactly will this happen? What is the story of the Dodo? Our next report telling you.
Is it possible to travel back in time? Not yet. Is it possible to bring species back from the dead? Well, that was not possible so far, but we could see it happening soon. Sounds like the plot of a sci-fi movie? It could soon be reality. What are we talking about? Meet the Dodo. If all goes as per plan, this bird could be making a comeback, and this is a big deal. Because it has been gone for way too long, since the 17th century to be precise, and now a billion-dollar startup wants to bring back the Dodo. The gene editing company has a plan to revive the extinct bird. It is adding the bird to a de-extinction agenda. This agenda already includes the woolly mammoth. The Dodo is a Mauritian bird. Humans last reported the sighting of the flightless bird in 1662. For over 350 years since then, the bird has remained extinct. The last sighting was reported on the island of Mauritius, east of Madagascar in the Indian Ocean. The Dodo was endemic to the region. Researchers believe Mauritius was the Dodo bird's only home. Evolutionary traits suggest that because the conditions there were so comfortable, the bird became flightless and was unable to leave. Gene editing techniques now exist that can help the scientists look for key traits in the Dodo genome. They believe they can reassemble these in the body of a living relative, like pigeons. As per the sequencing of the bird's genome, the Dodo's closest relatives are pigeons. They plan to study the DNA difference between the Dodo and its close relative, the Nicobar pigeon, to figure out which genes make the Dodo a Dodo. Scientists have said their work could help find out more about the bird's existence. They could also help with the conservation of rare species that are not yet extinct. As according to the IUCN, more than 42,100 species are threatened with extinction. But there are ethical questions as well over whether this sort of research should be pursued, and what this could mean in the long run. Bureau Report, World is One.
And on that note, it's a wrap on this edition of Gravitas Tonight. Thanks very much for watching.